Namaste. Welcome to tonight's Fireside Conversation. My name is Sagar, and I will be your host for the evening. For those of you who are new to Vijaramanthan, tonight's Fireside will consist of a 30-minute discussion between the speaker and myself, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. This is your chance to get involved, and I invite all of you, wherever you're joining us, at home, in the office, or on the road, to leave comments and questions on our YouTube live chat, but only if it's safe to do so. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the platform, the name Vijaramanthan is a Sanskrit phrase that translates to churning of ideas. Here we look at ideas impacting our society and evaluate them through the lens of dharma and sustainability. This evening's discussion will focus on the question, will we all be eating lab-grown food in 2050? For many of us, while COVID has been occupying the headlines for the last 6 to 12 months, it might come as a surprise that at the tail end of 2020, Singapore became the first country in the world to authorize commercial sale of lab-grown meat. Now, this makes an interesting conversation, as does this mark the turning point in the field of agriculture, nutrition, and largely to our lifestyle? It comes as no surprise that since 1961, land per capita has reduced 56% across the globe, making it increasingly difficult to sustain the global growing population, which is estimated to reach just under 10 billion by 2050. Impacts of climate change and agriculture makes the risks even further. And to ensure that we can feed a global population in 2050, many scientists and innovators have suggested lab-grown food as a way to ensure we can feed a global population in 2050. But it's not as simple as that. Questions such as the productive process is environmentally friendly has been raised by many people. The impact of lab-grown meat on our psychology and well-being is also something that a lot of people have raised. At the forefront of this conversation, and to help us unpack some of the deep questions, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Marianne Ellis. Marianne is a senior lecturer in biochemical engineering at the University of Bath. Her research is focused on bioprocess design for tissue engineering applications. She has an interest in the scale-up of non-animal technologies and cell therapies. Marianne is the founding director and CTO of Celis Limited. Good evening, Marianne. It's a pleasure to have you on our platform.
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you. And hello, everybody out there.
Brilliant. Right. To get started, Marianne, if I could request your opening remarks. We have 3 minutes, or you have 3 minutes. If I could possibly get you to tell us a little bit more, maybe on the basic end of what is lab-grown meat? For many of our audiences, they may not be familiar with the concept of lab-grown meat or lab-grown food at large. So 3 main questions, if you could possibly. What is lab-grown food and lab-grown meat? How is it made? And are we going to be eating it in 2050?
Sure. Okay. So what is lab-grown food? Well, lab-grown food really is a name or a way of describing food that has been invented or tested in a laboratory. So actually something like corn, which is Q-U-O-R-N. So corn is a product that is a meat-free alternative protein source. That is a lab-grown food because that was essentially first made along the way to being manufactured in a lab. The more common use of the term lab-grown food has been applied to things like cultured meat. So cultured meat, which is sometimes called lab-grown meat, has many names, in fact. It can be called cultivated meat, in vitro meat, is essentially muscle cells that are grown from animals. They're grown up in bioreactors, which are essentially containers to grow the cells, and they are then used to make meat products. The general consensus within the industry is that lab-grown meat in particular, so cultured meat is what I will call it. That's just what I call it. So just to say that's the natural term for me. Right. Cultured meat is believed to be real meat because it is the cells that you would eat if you were eating muscle cells, if you're eating pieces of muscle or meat. Meat, of course, is a very complex structure. And the very basic form of cultured meat does not replicate that. Cultured meat in its most basic form is just the muscle cells that will grow and produce the protein in the contractile structure that we know that allows us and the animals that we consume to move. More complicated structures can potentially be grown in the lab and manufactured as cultured meat, but you would need to add other cell types like muscle, like fat cells, for example, and to get the blood vessels as well to fully replicate that structure. There are people who are looking to do that, but we're some way off, and we expect to see that cultured meat in its first form will be used, so those muscle cells will be cultured meat and they'll be mixed with other ingredients to make protein alternative foods. So a little bit more about how they're made. So you can source the cells either from a biopsy, so from a live animal. You could source the cells from an animal that's been recently culled for the food chain. And you can also take cells from an animal and develop them into what's called an immortalized cell line that can grow many times, can keep on growing. And so you don't have to go back to the animal. So that would be the three starting points, although at some point that cell line would have to be sourced from an animal. Once you've got them, just like an animal needs to be fed, the cells need to be fed, and we grow them in something called cell culture media. And they also need to be attached to something called a scaffold. So you have your cells, you attach them onto a material, onto a polymer, say, and you feed them a solution, which is mostly water, but contains proteins and salts and amino acids, glucose and oxygen. And just like we have to eat and the animals have to eat, that's how we feed them. And all of this is contained in this special vessel called a bioreactor. And once we move from lab scale to manufacturing scale, then that's really where the bioreactor comes into play. And will we be eating these products in 2050? I think most definitely. I think we could see people eating these in the next few years. As you've just said, we've got just have had their product regulated in Singapore. And they will be launching soon, I understand. And even though we're not all going to have access to that, then it has to start somewhere. And so I think by 2050, cultured meat will be a genuine alternative, as a genuine protein alternative. We're also actually like to see a number of other products, other foods as lab-grown foods. People are working on milk, for example.
Yes. Yeah, I've come across somewhere in Israel. There's a clean milk manufacturing that's happening.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and in the US as well. So looking at making milk for baby formula instead of baby formula. Oh, so right. Yeah, so there's all sorts of things happening right. In terms of food stuff.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Okay, you've given me a lot of food for thought, and you've actually given me a lot of food for the discussion. I want to start off by sort of trying to understand the environmental impacts of meat 2.0 or cultured meat or lab-grown meat. One of the priorities for someone who has a vegetarian diet or that chooses to not eat animal products is the consideration for the environment. Is lab-grown meat good for the environment?
It's certainly looking like it will be. Now, it hasn't actually been grown on industrial scale, so we cannot say for sure the exact environmental impact of it. But what we are able to do is to take theoretical studies and do something called life cycle analysis, which is a technique that uses essentially software, and it uses amounts of energy or carbon for particular activities through the manufacturing process. And what that life cycle analysis is showing, and there's a number of people around the world working on this, taking data from other sectors, other food manufacturing sectors, and also from lab scale work. And even though they differ quite a lot, because it depends how you put the boundaries on the system. So, how far back when you're making the raw ingredients for your cell culture media, how do you make the raw ingredients? And so you see, so we have this circular economy, maybe go into that later. So if we look at the life cycle analysis and different ones, yes, they vary, but on the whole, what they're showing, what they're predicting is that cultured meat will, compared to current farming practices for beef, and even they differ across the world, but they're much improved for a number of areas. So looking at around a 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and around a 90% reduction, so kilogram for kilogram, in land use, and then a bit less clear is water, but around 50% of the water. And energy, however, is a bit more vague, but it's still looking like we would see a reduction.
Sure. And this is based on the scale at which lab-grown meat, once it is at full capacity, where we're producing the same amount,
exactly. It's think of it as kilograms of protein from a cow compared to kilograms of protein of cultured meat.
Right. Okay.
So it is, and that we have to, there's a lot of, as with all these studies, there's a lot of assumptions made, and we have to say that until it's built, we're not sure exactly what it will be. But it is worth recognizing that, I guess, animals and plants grown in different countries will actually have different requirements for water, and the like, and also there's different standards of environmental requirements and animal welfare requirements as well. So in the UK, for example, we have actually relatively high animal welfare standards. So there's really not much more intensification we could do in this country.
All right.
Some countries they could, and that is probably something we'd want to avoid, I think.
Right. Okay. You mentioned in your opening that to produce this on a larger scale, the use of bioreactors.
Yeah.
And obviously, if we get to the scale that we're talking about by 2050, will we be producing the waste as a result of the bioreactors? And how does that compare? Or is there any research to suggest?
Yeah, so it's a very good question actually on the waste, and there is more and more effort for all processing industries to look at something called waste valorization, which is taking a waste product and using it again, recycling it or making it more valuable. So compared to most industries, the waste is really not that harmful, because actually it's lactate, which is a common waste product from our metabolism, lactic acid in its ionic form, and ammonia, and then some other components, but it's I guess relatively non-toxic. All waste products can have an effect in a too high concentration, but lactic acid, in fact, is a very useful product because it's used for all sorts of things, including making biodegradable plastics. and it's also used in cosmetics as well. So there's certainly at the moment some higher value products that the waste could be made into. The ammonia could be used, say, for fertilizer. But there's whether it would be just because you can do something, it doesn't necessarily mean that the economic. But if I really do think that with good process design, and I guess I would say this because I'm a bioprocess engineer, but with good process design, we really do have the opportunity to have this closed system and have net zero. So have net zero carbon. So actually, because we're so early in this industry, and because we can design everything together with in mind that we want to keep the environmental impact low, we can do that from scratch. It's much easier to kind of build that up and iterate it than to do a really big change. So I think really great hope for, say, waste recycling and water recycling as well.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that. That's quite insightful. In my research, I didn't come across, well, I may have, I just probably didn't understand it the way you've just explained.
No, you probably didn't actually. So I'm quite impressed that you came up with it, because actually it's the waste products are things that people often forget about. So good question.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, so moving on, another consideration that people that don't consume animal meat is animal welfare and cruelty to animals. And I know you mentioned in the opening that there is a biopsy that's taken either from a live or a recently deceased animal. But is lab-grown meat cruel to animals?
No, I don't think. I mean, everybody, there's going to be a spectrum of what level of what would be classed as cruel to an animal. So there are some people would say that intensive farming is cruel, but free range farming is not. And on the other on the other extreme, in terms of this, it's any animal origin is cruel because you're using an animal. And I've actually had one person's perception is that it's actually worse to take from an animal because they didn't consent to it. So I can understand how some people actually would not want to eat cultured meat as a protein alternative. And I'm hoping by 2050 we have so many that this is a way to diversify food. We monocultures, only being able to have one thing is not good for the environment, and it's actually not good really for culture. We would get bored if we only had one protein source. So let's hope we have many and we can all choose. But my perception is that it's not cruel. There are veterinary limits on how big a biopsy you can take from an animal, and so that would have to be done by a trained veterinarian, and it would be it'd be a little bit painful, but so some people would say that would be okay. If you could take cells from an animal that so the older an animal gets, the less well their cells grow. So you could say you could just take cells from an old animal when it's died of natural causes, but the cells wouldn't actually grow that well. So you could have if assuming we've still got animals in the environment, which I'm sure we would, you could say that you could take cells from an animal that's recently deceased naturally. So yeah, I don't think it is, but I can understand that some people still wouldn't want to eat cultured meat ever, because at some point cells were taken from an animal.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. The question of agency is quite important for a lot of the community, especially within a large part of our audience. We have the Jain community whose central premise of their way of life is based on agency. So I'm happy to hear that we're discussing this. In my research, actually, now that you've given us that side, I came across fetal calf serum as a source to promote growth, and part of that process, so to speak. Is that, or could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I'm curious.
Sure, yeah. So fetal calf serum is something that the whole community, I would say the vast majority, if not the whole community, I can't speak for everybody, wants to replace. In fact, beyond that, fetal calf serum is a standard ingredient in cell culture media for cell culture, for research, for biomedical research and things. So there are alternatives, but they're not as good. And what serum contains is it's essentially the rest of the blood, not the red blood cells, but the rest of the blood. And it contains all sorts of proteins, about 1,000 components actually, but proteins and signaling molecules that are important and promote growth of any cell type. And so it's very common that, we basically still need to use this. There are alternatives that are very expensive and don't work so well. And there's a really big effort to move to using serum-free alternatives and to develop them that are affordable and effective. I'm not entirely, I don't know the process of how it's obtained fully, but it is it's obviously legal, but it is, I would say for me, it's on the further end of acceptable in terms of like animal use. So I would like to move away from it as soon as we can, but actually we still need to use it. And it's that I do, as you mentioned, I work in on animal technologies, and it's a constant battle between developing a technology that can replace animals in research or in food, but knowing to do that at the moment we have to use some animal derived products.
Sure. Yeah. And that dilemma, I think, is something that you must battle with every day.
Yeah. And even then it's spread into my entire wide ranging diet, and nothing is as simple as as what you might read on a label. So every time I pick up something in the supermarket, I am questioning exactly how sustainable it really is.
Okay. Yeah. I can understand. You mentioned something in your I think it was 2 comments back about the diversity of protein availability. And I wonder if lab-grown meat, at least maybe not now, in 2050, does it open us up, or does it open the conversation around developing a taste for exotic animals, endangered animals? And are we, through lab-grown meat and this variety of protein sources, are we unearthing something like exotic animals or endangered animals to satisfy our own curiosity?
I think there's definitely some there's been some sociology studies around this, and there is definitely scope for people to go towards that slightly more dystopian view of how it's used. But is that anything you can think of, there will be some people that probably will want to try it. And actually you could see that there have been these sort of future scenarios that people have looked at, all these different future scenarios, and that it becomes a bit of a status symbol, trying to find the most exotic animal, or trying to resurrect something like a dodo, and trying to grow extinct, trying to get cells and grow them from extinct animals and things. So I would like to think it's pretty unlikely that people would go out and find endangered animals, but maybe I'm just being optimistic. There's always going to be that risk. Now, I haven't actually tried cultured meat myself. Actually, relatively few people have. My colleague has, and he said that it when it was being cooked and when he tasted it, it smelled like meat. That umami, that in itself, to so I'm not a cook expert. So, meat smells like meat when it's cooking. And that most people, I would hope that would be enough. So one of the big drivers for people eating cultured meat is because they like meat. So it can be quite hard for some people, and it might even be culturally, but it's just what their family has done every Sunday, with so they actually, the cultured meat will replicate that, and therefore hopefully open up a more diverse protein source for people who would, who just want to eat meat. Whether people do kind of take it to extreme, and that's why legislation and regulation is so important. And how I mentioned to you earlier, we've been started to talk a little bit about in the policy space, because how we kind of regulate and recognize this new food stuff essentially is really key to ensuring good practice, and we hope that will have a global effect, so that there becomes standards of care, if you like, for of how we select and get cells.
Sure. On the regulation point you've just made, I was actually speaking to one of the elders in the community last night, and one of the questions he had was how, or what are the precautions, or maybe not can we take, but what are the precautions that are being taken to ensure that something that is theoretically possible now and is functionally viable now doesn't come to bite us in 10, 15, 20 years time? Are there regulatory bodies, are there laws or even ethics committees that discuss this?
Yes. Yes. No, yes, and yes. So, yes, so you've got the Food Standards Agency who would regulate this as a food product.
Yep.
You have the likes of the Food Ethics Council. There's a lot of organisations that would look at food and the ethics of them. So, and they're global as well. And so, we're slowly starting to see cultured meat kind of come onto their radar and have those conversations. There are no, I guess, laws in place yet in the UK. So we've seen that just has been regulated in Singapore. There's nothing yet in the UK. We work very closely. Our industry, if you like, works very closely with social scientists who look at consumer studies and look at the utopian, dystopian, possible futures. So we can try to envision what could be the risks to through this. It's obviously very hard. You cannot predict the future. Even with your most if it's right, I'm going to be non-biased in this. It's very hard to look at something from your perspective, but we are opening that conversation, and it's a really important part for the industry because if you're in it, you're already you're doing it because you believe it's the right thing to do. So you can become slightly kind of blind or to those to what could be bad. And so actually we started an organization called Cultivate, which is like a multi-voice forum, and we have an annual meeting, and the whole point of that is it's not just for advocates. We want people to come along and tell us, no, this is not good because, and then actually open that debate. Yeah. It's about having the conversation. So in terms of the food being regulated and talked about from an ethics perspective, that's actually all in place. And we can go through the normal steps, but I think we as a community have a moral duty to discuss this with as many people as possible, to open our minds to what could happen in the future.
Right. Of course. Right. Moving on to a topic that's very near and dear to my heart is health. Is lab-grown meat healthy?
So yeah, and also very dear to my heart as well. And it will depend on how people formulate cultured meat products.
Sure.
In itself, go back to the very standard form of cultured meat is just muscle cells. So, eaten as part of a balanced diet, that is your protein, and then, everything else is then choice and hopefully choice. Not everybody has food choice, of course, but if we in this country, most of us do. So then you choose what you eat with that protein for a balanced diet, and it can be healthy. Now, there's definitely a lot of what we see in the press is about burgers and nuggets and pate, and so things that are actually not considered healthy. So if we're not careful, we could end up with even with a reputation, but cultured meat being something that's not healthy. So in itself it is, and in fact, if we get to the stage of having these whole cuts of meat, cultured meat, then you could tailor the amount of fat and other components in that. There's a very long way off, but there is potential to do that. Until then, it comes down to what we need to do as an industry is be somehow encouraging the use of cultured meat in healthier products and as part of a healthy and balanced meal, not just taking the easy route and just making burgers.
Right. Sure. And okay, in which case, if the burgers and nuggets are what is advertised at the minute, if we can create a lean piece of meat that's grown in a lab, how does it compare to an organic piece of meat or animal meat in terms of its nutrition, its amino acid profile? Does it have the full spectrum? Is it restricting?
So we are expecting that it will have the full spectrum, which will come down to ensuring that the culture media essentially that will feed the muscle cells, and they will. One of the benefits is that we have something that I would term high protein density. So you've got all of the essential amino acids, and it has relatively high protein density because exactly like muscle does, meat does. So if you're looking at grams of protein per gram of food item, then actually is chicken, tuna, or higher protein and lower fat. So yes, it will be. I think there's an opportunity to tailor it, and that's the nice thing. We can tailor it to make it healthy.
Sorry, go on.
That's okay. So whether people choose to eat that and whether companies choose to make it is another matter.
Sure. And it increases the MPS if you're measuring for that. Muscle protein synthesis.
Again, a very good question. We're and nobody actually knows at the moment. And so one of the things that we're trying to understand is how efficient the protein production is.
Right.
And whether how do we get the highest protein yield, we would say, from processing perspective. And what the other thing, we're not entirely sure, there's still, we'll call it debate in the field as to whether we can achieve mature cultured meat, so mature muscle protein, whether we can do that with media and with small molecules, so just from signaling molecules, or whether we actually need some kind of like contractile function as well. So this, in terms of a foodstuff, these are questions that we still haven't answered. And one of the arguments for developing a cell line and not just using cells from a biopsy is that you can use synthetic biology to actually create a cell line that is better adapted to the culture environment, so that you do get the higher protein in the cells.
Okay, brilliant. Moving on to if the cultured meat has the same level of protein content density and the amino acid profile, with the rise in the last 5, maybe 10 years of plant-based alternatives to, or the rise of the vegan movement, how does lab-based meat compare to plant-based alternatives?
In terms of protein or in terms of acceptance in the
Well,
vegan
both.
community? Okay, so it looks like cultured meat will have a higher protein density.
Sure.
But that's not to say that you couldn't take plant-based protein alternatives and concentrate the protein in, like a way like we get from milk. So you can feasibly imagine that you could essentially isolate protein from plants and from cultured meat and have very high protein contents. So there's quite a lot of like manipulation you can do in product formulation to achieve high proteins, high concentrations of protein. The other important thing I think is also around the taste, and it comes down to personal perspective. I get quite a strange aftertaste after I've eaten a plant-based burger, because I eat meat and not a lot of it, but I do eat meat, so I actually notice slightly odd taste afterwards. Whereas my colleague who's tasted cultured meat, so you just don't get that, it's just like meat. So that whole experience of eating it, cultured meat, is likely to be preferable to somebody who is used to having meat in their diet.
Right.
So you could say who is cultured meat being targeted at?
Yeah.
Is it being targeted at people who are already eating vegetarian and vegan diets, or is it actually the people who eat meat?
Yeah.
And it probably is, in terms of if we want to have people moving away from eating quite so much animal protein. Now, in terms of acceptance in the vegan community, again, it depends why people have chosen to be vegan and the extent of their beliefs on that. But it is it seems to be that there are a lot of vegans who are very interested in this as a suitable alternative for the future.
Brilliant, thank you. I've seen over the last 5 to 5 odd years, with the rise of the plant-based alternatives, there's a parallel stream of carnivores that have become that much more ardent in their carnivorism, if I can.
Yeah, almost like it becomes an identity. So so people become more strongly that almost the need to to put their stake in the ground about their diet. And that, again, you would know more than me about this topic, but it is, that's human nature. And that need for identity, and people might change in their opinion. They might become just more extreme. And for me personally, it's I eat a really wide range of protein sources, actually. I'll try as many as I can, just because it's now related to my research. And it's made me question a lot more food sources, and I think that's a good thing. And I hope that just the dialogue out there in the world about cultured meat will just make people actually just question a bit more about how they're sourcing their food, whether that's meat or vegetables, actually, everything.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. We have come to the end of our discussion. We have a string of questions from our audiences. I would love to get into right away if I can.
Yeah, go for it.
So we have the first question from Brother, which is, at the beginning of the discussion, you mentioned lab-grown milk. Could you tell us more about the techniques behind this? Could this be considered vegan?
So lab-grown milk is made, so people are making the proteins in lab-grown milk. So well, there's two approaches. So you can make the proteins through fermentation. So you can take microorganisms and they can excrete proteins. There's also work looking at taking mammary cells that would excrete fully formed milk, if you like. So that would be more of a tissue engineering cultured milk. And then you've got a fermentation cultured milk where you're making the proteins and then, say, building the formula separately. So certainly from the fermentation perspective, that could be vegan. The tissue engineered approach, again, it's a bit less obvious at what point it becomes animal free, but if you can grow those cells without any animal like ingredients, and then depending on your limits of where those cells were sourced, then yes, potentially it could be vegan.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Right, so next question comes from Vidhi, and her question is, how do you anticipate lab-grown meat will be received from an economic perspective? Will there be a backlash from the meat industry, or if there is, do you see how, or do you see any solutions for this?
There has been a backlash in the States, in the USA, as much around naming of cultivated meat, lab-grown meat, and calling it meat. And there are groups that would like to see all farming eliminate or animal farming eliminated, and so therefore there are farmers who are understandably concerned about that.
Their livelihood is threatened.
Yeah, exactly. So our perspective, and certainly in the current world that we live with the current climate that we have and the current economic system, socio-economical system, and the political system, we anticipate that cultured meat could actually add value to farmers' livelihoods, because they could use their animals to source cells. So they could actually take cells from their animals and make cultured meat themselves, or sell those cells, or license those cells to people to make cultured meat. Yeah. So, a lot of farmers are really struggling. It's a really hard life. There are some very considerate farmers who care about the environment, want to keep a smaller farm with fewer animals, so not intensive. And this could be a way that they could basically stay afloat in the future.
Okay. Next question. A couple of people have asked about the potential dangers of cultured meat. So there's three particular questions. I'll give you all three, so then you can answer them as you want to. Can cultured meats carry diseases like the pandemic we're in, COVID-19? At the beginning of the discussion, you mentioned immortalized cell lines. Have immortalized cell lines ever been consumed before? And would antibiotics be added to prevent contamination?
Yeah, okay. So the first one, in terms of viruses, the process designed to make cultured meat is based on biomedical approaches to tissue engineering, and you have a very sterile process, because normally the techniques we're using, those products would go into humans. So we can and this process hasn't been built yet, but our kind of conceptual design would have a series of essentially filters that would capture mycoplasma all the way through to viruses, so that you would not get viruses in the bioreactor, and kind of going through. So the processing can be used to prevent contamination from viruses.
Right.
The second one was
immortalized cell lines.
So so this is where I'm actually still moving between the two. So up until relatively recently, I would have been very strongly towards primary cells as the the best source. But then I started to question why that was. It was more of an emotional response than actually a scientifically evidence-based response. And I now so they haven't been eaten, consumed generally. People might have been eating them in the lab. We haven't. They're not regulated to eat, but there is. They are likely to be safe as far as if you eat meat, if people who eat meat will have eaten cancer cells, because statistically that would have happened if you're eating meat. Yeah, and it's a similar thing. So when you immortalize a cell, then you're causing it to recreate over and over again. It goes to our digestive system, and so my expectation, I haven't studied this, it is not my area of expertise, is that they will be approved for consumption. And then the third one was antibiotics. So you can do cell culture tissue engineering without antibiotics, and I believe Just have confirmed that they aren't using antibiotics in their production, so we can be antibiotic free, which is great news.
Right, brilliant. Next question is from Nikhil. Could lab-grown meat be sentient? At what point do we draw the line? Actually, I'd like to add something to that as well. I was sort of in my thought experiments. I came across the idea that if you can grow a slab of meat and then a little bit more, then a little bit more, and you happen to grow a whole carcass, just without the brain, at what point can we call it an animal? And where do we draw the line?
I don't know. So this approach has been used, but turn it on its head for medical research. So it's something called systemic effects, is when you have a drug that you consume or you take, and that it affects your liver, but then that can affect your lungs or whatever. So there is actually interest in building systems where you have tissues from different organs or joined up. So it's not actually so far in the realms of sci-fi as you might think. Now, in reality, to actually grow fully functioning tissue of every single cell type is incredibly tricky. And whether we would ever get there. The question of sentience, for me, it wouldn't be, but that's a personal opinion. And again, that might change in 6 months when I know more. But for me, if you're growing just those cells from all the various tissues, they to me, they are just cells that are alive but not sentient.
Okay.
That's probably a very long discussion to have, but probably, we probably don't have time.
That's interesting. Live but not sentient.
So
can I push back on that a little?
Yeah.
Where is the line between live and sentient?
Yeah. So I think because the cells are just replicating of themselves. So for me, life involves well, not all life forms. This is why it's an interesting conversation, but most life forms have cells of different types. Yeah. So it's what you're saying. How do you build that up into something that is actually living? So, okay. So then let's take this. So you have you grow muscle with all its different types, but it's still not a muscle that's part of something that can move around.
Well, if by 2050 we're able to create the cartilage, the bone structure, and we can potentially have a carcass,
Yeah.
without the head or the brain, can we call that an animal? And at what point does it or does it not become sentient?
Yes. I think it needs a brain to be an animal, but only based on something that is, that is just what I feel more than anything, is that if, because there is that idea of having the chicken, you've seen cartoons of the chicken running around without a head on, which, is science.
Horrendous.
Yeah, it's just, and I think that it's, yeah, I think it's having, for an animal, it's the brain is basically essential.
Okay.
But I would also find it quite, I don't know, I'm not also hugely comfortable with having something that is, some kind of factory where you've got like everything but the head. For me, it's almost like, and this is where my engineering take is it, what would be the point? But some people, like you said, with the exotic and rare animals, some people might do it just because they can. Yeah. Yeah. So for me, I wouldn't feel comfortable with that, which, again, starts to.
Yeah, there's a moral dilemma in here, I think. Even Plato was grappling with over 2,000 years ago. And I think in a 2 to 3 minute conversation, I think we've done well. The next question is from Ajay. And what is the shelf life of lab-grown meat? Could it help prevent food waste?
Yeah, so it all actually comes down to what happens when you take it out the reactor. So if you don't expose it to the environment, it's sterile, and it can have we think, a really, really long shelf life, as long as you can package it in sterile, wrapping. Then yes, it could help food waste. Of course, if you then open it up and you leave it hanging around on a really dirty work surface, then actually tissue culture is very susceptible to contamination and growing like fungus and stuff. So you would have to keep it sterile, but it would be. I had the conversation about this with a farmer actually, and we expect that the up to the bioreactor and removing it from the bioreactor, that would be basically almost medical grade, because you need that, as we said, with virus removal, and just to keep it so you're only growing the muscle cells, you've got no contamination. But after that, you can move into food grade. And meat, if you think, when it's hanging, it's exposed to the environment. So there is the kind of the food grade, which would probably reduce its shelf life, unless you're combining it with a lot of salt or something, which then would kind of prolong it again. But the short answer is, yes, we are expecting we can have products with very high shelf life. So even taking food into preformed food into space, or having it as in nutrient packets for refugees, that could travel around the world and wouldn't have to be kept cold. It could be used anywhere.
Right. And I think we've got a minute left. I might tag in a small question of my own. How does lab-grown meat impact our gut microbiome?
Oh, very good question. I would think that if you're eating meat, it would be the same. But because it is so pure and sterile, it could actually reduce it. So well, because you it depends what you mix it with. But if you eat it pure and sterile, then the reason we have already in our typical diet in the West has we have a much narrower biome than if you're than our I guess tribes or people who roam, or nomads. So we should, I guess, make sure that we add it with other components that maintain a healthy microbiome.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much for that. We've come to the end of our Q&A. If I could request your closing remarks, please, Marianne. Primarily, if you could, based on the conversation and the topic we've had, if you could possibly comment on the topic of, or maybe not topic, but on the question around, as humans, we have freedom of choice and the ability to exercise agency. And our ability to exercise agency, therefore, gives us a greater responsibility to look after life on Earth. How do you see lab-grown meat, if at all, facilitate this responsibility?
So I believe that cultured meat is a way to diversify our protein sources as a protein alternative, and that it will be one of a number of different choices that we can eat, and that we have to, as a species, we have to, for those who can afford to, make more informed and environmentally friendly decisions. Cultured meat for me is something that can simultaneously address a number of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, including zero hunger, climate action, and good health and well-being, if it is done well. And we've talked, somewhat about this, about having a moral duty that that those in the industry actually make sure that we develop this industry in a way that does help people understand how they can eat cultured meat and lab-grown foods, to help society to make those decisions to help on a daily basis address the UN SDGs. It's going to take a lot of conversation and a lot of expertise and skill sets to do that, whether we're engineers, scientists, psychologists, sociologists, philosophers. We all need to work together on this. Right.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much. That brings us to our conclusion. So I would like to thank you very, very, very much. It has been an insightful and extremely informative fireside conversation. So thank you so much, Marianne. It's been an absolute pleasure having you with us on this platform. And to conclude, I would like to thank all of our audiences for taking the time to join the discussion. Please accept my apologies if I've not been able to get to your questions. And last but not least, I would like to thank our well-wishers. Their support makes these events possible. And if you like what we do and would like to support our efforts, please visit us on our website at www.vicharamanthan.org. On the website, you can also join our mailing list and have a scroll through our past events. We have recently launched the VM podcast as a brand new Vicharamanthan project. The third episode is out, where we look to explore womanhood. Please follow us on Facebook and Instagram for events and content. We also hold weekly book clubs across the VM chapters, and it's a space where you can engage in earnest exploration of ideas that range from theology all the way to dystopian futures. And finally, before we finish, I'd like to give you an update on our next panel discussion, which will be Uncovering the Mind. What can we learn from psychedelics, on Saturday, 3rd of April at 7 p.m. I hope you all are able to join us. Have a lovely evening and stay safe. Namaste.